finance. So we called it a property theory of Islamic finance, especially compared with the way it is thought of usually as historic, based on the historical arrangements that sharing risk is the foundation of Islamic finance, and Islamic finance should be based on sharing risk from probably this idea that the word Catalan also came, that Islamic finance is tasharuki. It is not tasharuki. We will discuss this issue, whether it's really tasharuki or it is not. So this is the sometimes and very often history affects our minds and keeps us sometimes kind of blocked within the box of history. What has happened in Islamic finance is exactly that same thing. The first experience of Islamic finance was the experience of Mead Ghamar. Mead Ghamar was in fact a saving association, saving investment organizations or associations. They were not at all banks, and they were not licensed as banks. They were not treated as banks. They did not have the nature of banks, but we've always thought of them as banks. So that experiment was an experiment of taking funds on mudaraba basis from depositors, and of course use it for investment to make profit, because mudaraba intends to make profit. So we made profit out of them through this investment with the local businessmen. So because we thought of that as a bank, we thought that bank should work only on mudaraba. So that bank should work only on risk sharing, that you take funds on mudaraba, you give funds on mudaraba, or even if you expand it a little beyond mudaraba, then go to musharaka also. So it has to be given on risk sharing. And until today, in fact, there are many writings who would say, oh, the foundation of Islamic finance is risk sharing, which is in fact, to me, kind of strange. I wouldn't claim that I am a faqih, but I do claim that I have a strong fiqh background and strong fiqh study. So it looks to me that very, very strange from the reality of fiqh, which is essentially the minute discussion or rulings or the directives of action for us in general. Now, if we look at another experience, the experience of Tabung Haji. Tabung Haji in Malaysia came around the same time, even 1 year earlier than Mead Ghamar, but in the early 1960s. But Tabung Haji was never at all thought of as a bank, and it was considered as a fund and a management constituted, created by the government to help people go for Hajj. Part of helping them going for Hajj is to accumulate savings and to invest these savings. It was never thought of in Malaysia as a bank, and it was never treated as a bank until today, as a matter of fact. So we did not carry the same idea of putting fund to make it to grow and have it, use it for profit objective. That was not carried on into the bank. When the first Islamic bank established in Malaysia, it took the sample of banks, Islamic banks that were created in the Middle East. not take the form of tabung haji. Banks in the Middle East, when they were established, the first commercial Islamic bank was established in Dubai. It could not function as a bank, as a matter of fact, for the first maybe 2 or 3 years. Continued to, instead of providing financing, they started trading real estate, buying properties, lands, and selling lands, until when the land prices got a crisis in Dubai, and land prices went down very drastically, the bank was on the verge of bankruptcy, or it was in fact in full bankruptcy, unless it was salvaged by the founder of the bank, putting in more funds in it to salvage the bank. But the real process of Islamic banking came with the invention, we call it, of Murabaha, with Sami Mahmoud rahimahullah, and deservingly Sami Mahmoud was given the first prize of IDB in Islamic finance. He came with the Murabaha idea, as he quoted it from the Shafi'i book Al-Umm, and the Murabaha was really the savior of Islamic banking all the way since that time. And it carried then the idea of So it carried the idea that the Murabaha creates convenience for as a base of Islamic bank. Now, when Islamic banks started existing in several countries, of course, it was obvious that we should use or these banks will use the expertise of some of the shuyukh. I hope that some of you may read my paper on the alliance between Islamic capitalist and Sharia scholarship. The Sharia scholars, at the beginning, of course, and continuously, always, all the time, advised Islamic banks that they should use sale contract, and of course they can use also mudaraba and musharaka and so on. Unfortunately, ijara came late, and it didn't really come until the mid-90s. That's about 20 years after the beginning of Islamic banks. Ijara came as another channel for Islamic finance, and it took its place, as a matter of fact, next to sale, and musharaka and mudaraba declined to be the least applied in Islamic finance. Islamic finance, as derived from the Sharia principles, uses 3 channels of financing. These 3 channels are sale channels, lease channels, and sometimes, rarely, the major part is sale, and then next to it is ijara or leasing, and then the least one is musharaka and mudaraba, or sharing in general. But when we look at these 3 channels of finance, we will notice also in them that they really, the common thing between them, the 3 of them, is ownership. You can sell after you buy. And of course, you buy means you become an owner, and then you sell. The same thing, you can give on leasing, you can give on ijara, a property, an asset, of course, after you own it. And if you don't own it, you cannot give it on ijara. And the same thing when you create an enterprise or a project or a business, or when you expand it on the basis of musharaka or mudaraba. Also, we should notice that it is by virtue of owning that you deserve the profit. So when we look at these channels, we notice that owning a property, owning an asset, owning goods, is what makes you make profit in finance, and without it, you cannot make profit. So, of course, lending is excluded, and obviously lending for increment, for profit, for additions is not acceptable in Sharia. That is the meaning of that prohibition of interest. Very often we read in some books that the focus point of Islamic finance is the prohibition of interest. And that is, logically to me, is a wrong statement, in fact, because you cannot think of anything as being a main issue, and that thing itself is negative. Not doing a thing is not really, cannot be a focus point or a center point of any action and any project, and of course any profit. By not making loans on interest basis, that doesn't make and doesn't define and does not really introduce what is finance. Unfortunately, you find that in many books, and this is kind of a puzzle to me. On these differences, we mean here return as we know it in finance. You cannot have a return according to these three channels unless you own a property that is able to generate added value in a sense of real addition to the GDP of the country or of the society or whatever you call it. So here we talk about then ownership as basis of Islamic finance, and exactly that, ownership but not risk sharing. Risk sharing that was carried in our mind for a long period, and it is still occupies a big chunk of the minds of many writers, that risk sharing is so important in the Islamic finance, looks that it has really no importance at all, and it failed to be in the basic fundament of Islamic finance. Now, on the two sides of an Islamic financial institution, on the side of the resource mobilization, acquiring resources, we use resources, we acquire resources either on musharaka or on mudaraba. In both, we create ownership, and by virtue of that ownership, that those who provided funds on musharaka basis or those who provided funds on mudaraba basis, only on the basis of that ownership that they deserve profit, not on the basis of risk sharing. And we will look at the issue of risk and discuss it also, and notice that the risk is like entitlement. Entitlement is the deservance of the earning. You are entitled to that earning because you own, not because you bear risk. And risk is similar to entitlement. Both of them are two facets of ownership. If you own a thing, you are exposed to the risk that this thing is exposed to. And of course, you are entitled to any increment that is that may take place in that asset, in that property that you own. I like to go a little bit beyond the issue of finance. We look at ownership as really a fundamental thing that allows you or entitles you to earn a return. Even when we talk about service, when you provide service that you own, you earn also wage on it. Even with that, you, by providing that, call it factors of production, you earn a return. And then the idea of ownership goes beyond finance to be also in Islamic economics as a fundamental thing. One of the causes of value creating is a property. Of course, the other cause is labor. The labor, but labor also is associated with being provided as a service, is not independent from the idea of being provided into the production as a service, as one of the factors of production. And then owners of factors of production, by virtue of ownership, deserve their returns. So the theory then of ownership does not only apply in finance, it applies also in production, it applies also in distribution, as a matter of fact. The functional distribution of the factors of production, or to the factors of production, is based also on the ownership principle. You own the service that you provide, and you deserve the price of that service. You own a machine that you provide in the production, and you deserve the return of that machine, and so on. It goes on for all factors of production. So ownership is the basis of getting a return or earning. Now, why does the lender not able to deserve in our Islamic economics any return? A lender may sometimes share risk, and there is a suggestion, there is a book by some writers that in it they suggest that the lenders in America should share with the borrowers in house financing the market risk of the item they finance. And even if they share, first of all, let's start with the idea that a lender, of course, bears a risk, bears credit risk. But in addition to bearing a credit risk, if a lender shares the market risk, does that justify his earning? It does not. The principle in our Sharia is that since the lender does not own a property that is able to generate additional value, added value, then the lender it does not deserve any part of added value, because there is no added value that is created to begin with. The lender owns a debt, and the debt does not generate added value. The debt, by its nature, is not able to create increments, and therefore a lender is not in a position to deserve any increment. So the theory goes, in fact, in a consistent way all through. Even if the lender shares the market risk, still the lender should not deserve, because the lender does not own an asset that generates added increment. If you take the idea of risk sharing, perhaps we should allow the lender to be, if the lender shares that risk, we should allow the lender to earn then interest on his loan. If we consider the idea of risk sharing as a basis for Islamic finance, this is one of the flaws also of that risk sharing concept. So why did the proposition of risk sharing fail in Islamic finance? Actually, in reality, Islamic finance went through murabaha, went through ijara, and very little bit of it went through musharaka or ijara. And even when it does, it is the fundament of owning a property that generates increment is what justifies even in mudaraba and in musharaka. But when we look at why the proposition failed, first and most obvious, of course, because risk sharing does not accommodate consumer financing. You cannot finance consumer on risk sharing, although there were some attempts by some writers that we finance building of human capital. I mean, they use the term human capital, although it is a human being, but human capital, building human capital can be also shared. So you share the return of that human capital if you finance the construction of that capital through, for instance, education. So you can educate a person and then later share his salary or his return, his income in the market. That was a proposition that was rejected by everybody and tolerated, in fact, because it was called that they applied to it. Actually, all scholars, the idea of akil amwal al-nas bil-batil, taking part of the properties of the earning of somebody without any reason at all, because you can't really share the human abilities. So risk-sharing concept failed in accommodating consumer finance. Risk is not able to generate added value. This is the essential thing. Risk is not a property, is not a thing that can generate added value. And it is really not a thing that can be traded, and not a thing that can be owned. Do you own risk? Do you handle risk as separate from an item or as separate from action or property? It cannot be separated from action or property, and risk alone then cannot be traded and cannot be owned and cannot be considered, cannot generate any added value. This is one of the implications of this, is that we do not accept the sale of risk in insurance. And the idea of selling risk when it is risk alone, of course, this is in insurance, it's clear it becomes risk alone. It cannot be really, for risk, to mitigate risk, we cooperate to mitigate risk rather than we sell risk. Risk sharing does not accommodate the need for definite cash flow. In the finance business, you need definite cash flow. And if you cannot produce a good expectation of a definite cash flow, then it doesn't work really in finance. So and risk sharing does not accommodate that. both in terms of the amount of cash flow and in terms of its due date. Risk sharing is not compatible with the regulations that are common in banking and finance. Preference of risk sharing is not compatible with human nature. Human nature is to avoid risk as much as you can. And risk sharing is even worse than bearing risk, because risk sharing, you are carrying the risk also of another person, which the Quran gave a negative description on it when it says the term shuraka'u mutashakisun, that there is likelihood. Whether it is more common or less common is really immaterial. There is likelihood